in nomine Christo Redemptoris, in nomine Mashiach Redemptoris. Structure and Functions of the Body, a Handbook of Anatomy and Physiology for nurses and others desiring a practical knowledge of the subject, by Annette Fisk, A.M., graduate of the Waltham Training School for Nurses. Illustrated, Philadelphia and London, W.B. Saunders Company, 1911. Copyright 1911 by W.B. Saunders Company, printed in America. A free publication of Project Gutenberg, and read to you and produced by Christopher Robert Neal, Doctor of Jurisprudence, in the year 2022 during the plague. Chapter 2, The Skin, Its Appendages and Its Function. The Skin, Appendages of the Skin, Nails, Hair, Sebaceous Glands, Sweat Glands, Sweat, Temperature Regulation, Fever, Sense of Touch, Touch Corpuscles. Chapter 3, The Cranium and Face, the Cranial Bones, Frontal Bone, Parietal Bones, Occipital Bone, Occipito-frontalis Muscle, Temporal Bones, Sphenoid or Wedge Bone, Ethmoid Bone, Turbinated Bones, Ossification of Sutures or Sutures, Bones of the Face, Superior Maxillary Bones, Antrum of Highmore, Malar or Cheek Bones, Lacrimal Bones or Lacrimal Bones, Palate Bones, Nasal Bones, Vomer, Inferior Turbinated Bones, Inferior Maxillary Bone or Lower Jaw, Sublingual Gland, Submaxillary Gland. Chapter 2, The Skin, Its Appendages and Its Function. The whole exterior surface of the body is covered by skin, an excreting and absorbing organ which serves as a protection to the parts beneath and is also the organ of touch. It has two layers, a superficial and a deep. The superficial layer, the epidermis or cuticle, is composed wholly of epithelial cells, of which the deepest layer is columnar and molded upon the papillary layer of the derma, while the intermediate layers are more rounded and the surface ones flat. The deepest layer also contains the skin pigment, or skin pigment, which causes the variation in shade between the Indian, the Negro or black man, and the white man. Below epidermis, which is chiefly protective, is the tough, elastic, and flexible tissue of the derma or true skin, in which are vested most of the activities of the skin. Its surface is covered with papillae, which are more numerous in the more sensitive parts. Each papilla contains one or more capillary loops and one or more nerve fibers, while some terminate in an oval body known as a tactile corpuscle. Beneath the papillae is the reticular layer, composed of interlacing bands of fibrous tissue and containing blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves, as well as unstripped muscle fibers, where hair is present. At the apertures of the body, the skin stops and is replaced by mucous membrane, an integument of greater delicacy, but which consists fundamentally of the same two layers, a superficial, bloodless epithelium and a deep fibrous derma. It is continuous with the skin, but is much redder and more sensitive and bleeds more easily. The passages and cavities that it lines, unlike those lined by serous membranes, communicate with the exterior of the body and are for that reason protected against contact with foreign substances by mucus, which is thicker and more sticky than the lymph that moistens the endothelium found on serous surfaces. Mucous membrane is found in the alimentary canal, the respiratory tract, and the genitourinary tract. In cavities like the stomach and intestines, which are subject to variations in capacity, it is thrown into folds or rugae. The mucus is secreted by small glands in the membrane. Appendages of the skin. The skin has various appendages. On the dorsal surface of the last phalanges of the fingers and tone, on the dorsal surface of the last phalanges of the fingers and toes are flattened and horny modifications of epithelium, the nails. They have a root embedded in a groove of skin by which they grow in length and a vascular matrix of derma beneath them which gives growth and thickness. To their growth and length there seems to be no limit. The hairs, also, which occur all over the body, except on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, are a modification of the epithelium. Each hair has a bulbous root springing from an involution in the epidermis and derma called the hair follicle, into which one or two sebaceous glands empty. It is raised by involuntary muscle fibers and grows by constant additions to the surface by which it is attached. This growth seems, however, to be limited, and when its term is reached, the hair falls out and is replaced by another. The horny epithelial cells that go to form the hair contain the pigment that gives it its color. Like the hairs, the sebaceous glands are situated in all parts of the body except the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. They lie in papillary layers and empty into the hair follicles except occasionally, when they empty directly upon the surface of the skin. They secrete an oily substance, sebum, the debris resulting from the degeneration of the epithelial cells of the gland itself, which serves to keep the hair glossy and the skin soft and flexible. The sweat glands, on the other hand, are more frequent on the palms and soles, and, though sometimes found in the derma, are usually situated lower down in the subcutaneous cellular tissue. They are least numerous on the back and neck. Coiled up in the lower layers of the skin, they discharge the sweat through a spiral excretory duct upon its free surface. The sweat is a clear, colorless, watery fluid with a salty taste, an alkaline reaction, and a characteristic odor that varies with the individual. If very scanty, it may be acid in reaction. Besides water, it contains a small percentage of solids, as inorganic salts, especially sodium chloride, fatty acids, neutral fats, and at times, especially in some diseases of the kidneys, urea, that is, the end products of the metabolism of starches and fats chiefly. There is usually also some carbon dioxide, whence the expression cutaneous respiration. The sweat serves to keep the skin moist and in good condition, to remove outworn and poisonous or irritating matters, and to regulate the temperature. As a rule, it evaporates upon reaching the surface, in which case it is known as invisible or insensible perspiration. But if conditions of the atmosphere are not favorable to prompt evaporation, as when the air is damp, the skin comes the skin becomes damp, and there is visible perspiration. The sweat serves to keep the skin moist and in good condition, to remove outworn and poisonous or irritating matters, and to regulate the temperature. As a rule, it evaporates upon reaching the surface, in which case it is known as invisible or insensible perspiration. But if conditions of the atmosphere are not favorable to prompt evaporation, and when the air is damp, the skin becomes damp, and there is visible perspiration. Though an abundant supply of blood increases the action of the sweat glands, they are regulated by definite secretory nerves rather than by the vasomotor nerves. In a cold sweat, the action is probably due to some disturbance of the nerve supply without increase of the blood supply. Ordinarily, perspiring is a reflex act due to the stimulation of the afferent cutaneous nerves as by the application of heat, but sometimes, as in cases of strong emotions, involuntary impulses are sent from the brain to the spinal centers and so arouse the action of the glands. Atropine has the power of preventing the secretion of sweat by paralyzing the terminations of the secretory or secretory nerves, while pilocarpine produces an opposite effect in a similar way. On account of these sweat glands, the skin becomes next in importance after the kidneys in the excretion of waste products. The quantity of sweat excreted varies greatly and is hard to measure. It is influenced by the temperature and humidity of the surrounding air, by the nature and quantity of food and drink consumed, by the amount of exercise, the relative activity of other organs, especially the kidneys, and by certain mental conditions. The hotter it is, the greater the amount of perspiration. In damp weather, there may be less perspiration, but it does not evaporate and is therefore more in evidence. Ordinarily, man has a temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The source of this body heat or temperature is the general body metabolism, or the source of this body heat or temperature is the general body metabolism, muscular activity, and activity of the glands, especially of the liver, which is constantly active. The blood in the hepatic vein being warmer than that in any other part of the body. The tissue of the brain also is said to be warmer than the surrounding blood, and the heat and respiratory muscles, which are in constant activity, are responsible for much of the body heat. The amount of heat generated in the body, therefore, varies at different times according as a person is awake or asleep, quiet or active. Temperature regulation. The temperature is regulated by variations in the production and loss of heat, less being known of its production than of its loss. It has been calculated that 4/5 of the energy of the body is converted into heat, 1/5 into work. As the minimum amount of heat produced in 24 hours is sufficient to raise 10 gallons of water from 0 degrees to boiling point. Now, if this is 0 degrees Celsius to boiling point, which is 100 degrees Celsius, quite amazing. It is evident that if there were not some way for the escape of much of this heat, I'll reread the paragraph without comment. Temperature regulation. The temperature is regulated by variations in the production and loss of heat, less being known of its production than of its loss. It has been calculated that 4/5 of the energy of the body is converted into heat, 1/5 into work. As the minimum amount of heat produced in 24 hours is sufficient to raise 10 gallons of water from 0 degrees to boiling point, it is evident that if there were not some way for the escape of much of this heat, the body would become hotter and hotter and finally destroy itself. The temperature, however, except on the surface, is uniform, heat being lost as fast as it is produced. For although oxidation at any point raises the heat of the blood at the point, this heat is carried by the blood to other parts, to which the supply is given up, while blood cooled in the skin goes to the hotter inward parts to cool them and be warmed itself. In fact, heat is expended by conduction and radiation through respiration, perspiration, and heat given to the urine and feces. It is, therefore, largely 75 to 80% carried off through the skin and the lungs. 60 to 70% is lost by radiation to the air and other bodies with which the body comes in contact. 20 to 30% is lost by the evaporation of sweat. 4 to 8% by the warming of expired air, urine, and feces, and 1 to 2% by cold food that is taken in. Radiation acts more favorably when the surroundings are cool and the air in motion, as on a breezy day. Conduction is carried on best where the surrounding air is cool, especially if it is moist, for moist air is a better conductor of heat than dry air. Evaporation is very important in hot weather or where men work in hot air. Even in health, the temperature may range from 98.6 degrees to 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit, and a degree or two below or above is not dangerous. When a person first gets up in the morning, his temperature is apt to be subnormal. But after food and exercise have been taken, it becomes normal and stays so to the end of the day, when if the person is tired, it may go up a little. If a person is tired out, the temperature is apt to be subnormal. There is also in the body what is called the vital tide, which is highest afternoon and evening and lowest in the morning. The rate of production of heat varies greatly in different people. One person uses a certain amount of tissue more quickly than another. That is, he lives faster. Moreover, size makes a difference in that a small body has more surface to its weight than a large one, and so has to produce the same amount of heat at a faster rate in order to maintain the right temperature. Taking food increases heat, probably because of the muscular effort needed to eat it. Muscular work is another factor. And finally, the whole matter of heat production seems to be under the control of the nervous system. Not much is known on this point except that there is a heat center in the medulla which plays an important part in heat production and whose influence is seen where the temperature shoots up in disease just before death. It is now thought that fever is due to a disturbance of this nervous mechanism, though just what the disturbance is not known. Fever is a condition of increased bodily temperature due to increased production or to decreased loss of heat. As a rule, in all fevers, the metabolic changes in the body are increased. Hence, the patient becomes emaciated in a long fever. The frequent increase in the amount of urea during fever shows an increase in protein metabolism. The temperature in fevers rises as high as 106 degrees Fahrenheit, and in sunstroke sometimes to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Except in sunstroke, a higher temperature than 106 degrees generally means death. Subnormal temperature is due to a decrease in the bodily metabolism and so to lessened heat production. As a rule, if the functions are all active, especially that of the sweat glands, a person can be exposed to severe heat without the temperature being affected, though sometimes on a hot summer day it may be up half to 1 degree. The cause of heat stroke with its high fever is unknown. but probably it is due to some effect on the heat center in the brain. Heat prostration is also due to prolonged exposure to heat, but is generally accompanied by a subnormal temperature. The effect of cold, as in freezing, is to diminish all the metabolic activities of the body. The effect of cold, as in freezing, is to diminish all the metabolic activities of the body. The temperature can be artificially regulated more or less by variations of food, varying amounts of exercise, by drugs, etc. Sense of touch. Before passing on to a discussion of the individual parts, a few words might well be said of the sense of touch, since that is general and resides largely in the skin, whose other functions have just been described. It may be regarded as the form from which all the other special senses have developed. Certain portions of the body, having become more sensitive than others to certain vibrations, as the eye to those of light. The internal organs probably have little sense of touch. Touch is useful only within arm's reach, but there gives one a sense of space that sight does not give. It is practically determined by the touch corpuscles, which are found in the skin over almost the entire body. Though they are more numerous in some places than in others, the distribution of the corpuscles determining the sensitiveness of the skin. These touch corpuscles are protoplasmic bodies containing nuclei, about which are entwined filaments from the cutaneous nerves. Where the corpuscles are absent, the filaments of the cutaneous nerves themselves play an important part. The fingertips have a very delicate sense of touch, and the tip of the tongue is the most sensitive part of the body. Hence, spaces in the mouth seem larger than elsewhere. By the transmission of sensations of touch to the brain, the sensation is localized and the tactile sensation becomes a tactile perception. There are three main divisions of the sense of touch: sensations of touch proper, or tactile sensations, sensations of temperature, and three, again, there are three main divisions of the sense of touch. Number one, sensations of touch proper, or tactile sensation. Number two, sensations of temperature. And number three, sensations of pain. The temperature sense is the transmission by the skin of sensations, not so much of a certain degree of heat or cold as of the difference between the temperature of an object and that of the skin. The larger an object is in contact with the skin, the less conscious the person is of it, not only because it becomes of the same temperature, but also because he becomes accustomed to it. There also seem to be in the skin, besides the touch corpuscles, two other terminal organs which separate nerve fibers, the one for detecting heat, the other cold. For there are places on the body where heat can be detected and cold cannot, and vice versa. Sensations of pain may be merely an exaggeration of tactile sensation, as in too hard pressure or too great heat. but there seems to be also a sensation of pain in the skin. All organs are said to have common sensibility to pain, and any exaggeration of this sensibility causes a sensation of pain. All the special senses require a certain amount of judgment in the interpretation of the sensation they convey. End of chapter 2, the skin. Structures and functions of the body. A handbook of anatomy and physiology for nurses and others desiring a practical knowledge of the subject, by Annette Fisk, A.M., graduate of the Waltham Training School for Nurses. Illustrated, Philadelphia and London, W.B. Saunders Company, 1911. Copyright 1911 by W.B. Saunders Company, printed in America. Chapter 3, the Cranium and Face. The Cranial Bones, Frontal Bone, Parietal Bones, Occipital Bone, Occipito-frontalis Muscle, Temporal Bones, Sphenoid or Wedge Bone, Ethmoid Bone, Turbinated Bones, Ossification of Sutures, Bones of the Face, Superior Maxillary Bones, Antrum of Highmore, Malar or cheekbones, Lacrimal Bones, Palate Bones, Nasal Bones, Vomer, Inferior Turbinated Bones, Inferior Maxillary Bone or lower jaw, Sublingual Gland, Submaxillary Gland. Chapter 3, the Cranium and Face. The intelligence and all the special senses, except the sense of touch already spoken of, are gathered together compactly in the head, where they are carefully protected with bony tissue. Covering the brain is the skull or cranium, which is made up of 8 bones: the frontal, the occipital, 2 parietal, 2 temporal, the sphenoid, and the ethmoid, while the bones of the face are 14 in number: 2 nasal, 2 superior maxillary, 2 lacrimal, 2 malar, 2 palate, 2 inferior turbinated, the vomer, and the inferior maxillary. For the most part, the bones are arranged in pairs, one on either side. The cranial bones. The cranium or skull is especially adapted for the protection of the brain, and the bones are flat and closely fitted to its surface. They have 2 layers of bone, the outer and the inner tables, of which the outer is thicker, and between these is a tissue filled with blood vessels, the diplu. In the infant, whose brain has not yet attained its full size, opportunity must be left for growth, and the skull therefore consists of a number of bones with interlocking notched edges, where growth takes place, but in the adult it forms one solid covering of bone. The line where the edges of 2 cranial bones come together is called a suture. The suture between the frontal bone and the forward edges of the two parietal bones is called the coronal suture. That between the two parietal bones at the vertex of the skull is known as the longitudinal or sagittal suture, and that between the occipital bone and the edges of the parietal bones as the lambdoidal suture, Lambdoidal, where the coronal and sagittal sutures meet is a membranous interval known as the anterior fontanelle, while the posterior fontanelle is at the juncture of the sagittal with the lambdoidal suture. These fontanelles are called from the pulsations of the brain that can be seen in them. Close after birth, either by the extension of the surrounding bones or by the development in them of small bones known as wormian bones, the posterior one closing within a few months, the anterior by the end of the second year. In rickets, however, the anterior fontanelle remains open a long time, sometimes into the fourth year. The frontal bone, as its name implies, forms the part of the head or forehead. The frontal bone, as its name implies, forms the fore part of the head or forehead. It joins the parietal bones above the temporal bones on either side. At the lower edge are the supraorbital arches, each with a supraorbital notch or foramen on its inner margin for the passage of the supraorbital vessels and nerve. The nerve most affected in neuralgia or neuralgia. Just above the arches on either side are the superciliary ridges, behind which, between the two tables of the skull, lie the frontal sinews. On the inner surface, the frontal sulcus for the longitudinal sinus runs along the median line. The parietal bones are the side bones of the skull. They meet each other in the sagittal suture at the median line above and join the frontal and occipital bone at either end, while below they touch upon the temporal bones, the temporal muscles being attached in part along their lower surface. These muscles are inserted into the coronoid process of the lower jaw, which they thus help to raise and to retract. The occipital bone is at the base of the skull and at birth consists of four pieces. In the lower anterior part is the foramen magnum, an oval opening through which the spinal cord passes from the skull down into the spiral. In the lower anterior part is the foramen magnum, an oval opening through which the spinal cord passes from the skull down into the spinal canal. Halfway between the foramen and the top of the bone is the external occipital protuberance for the attachment of the ligamentum nuchae, which holds the head erect. The inner side of the bone is deeply concave and is divided by a cross-shaped grooved ridge into four foci. The interior occipital protuberance, or the interior occipital protuberance, being situated where the arms of the cross meet. The inner side of the bone is deeply concave and is divided by a cross-shaped, grooved ridge into four foci, the internal occipital protuberance being situated where the arms of the cross meet. The occipital lobes of the cerebrum lie in the two upper foci, and the hemisphere of the cerebellum in the two lower ones. In the grooves upon the ridge are the sinuses which collect the blood from the brain. It seems that my head is a bit shy. Let me read all that again. The occipital bone is at the base of the skull and at birth consists of four pieces. In the lower anterior part is the foramen magnum, an oval opening through which the spinal cord passes from the skull down into the spinal canal. Halfway between the foramen and the top of the bone is the external occipital protuberance for the attachment of the ligamentum nuchae, which holds the head erect. The inner side of the bone is deeply concave and is divided by a cross-shaped, grooved ridge into four foci. The internal occipital protuberance being situated where the arms of the cross meet. The occipital lobes of the cerebrum lie. The occipital lobes of the cerebrum lie in the two upper foci, and the hemispheres of the cerebellum in the two lower ones. In the grooves upon the ridge are the sinuses which collect the blood from the brain. The occipital and frontal muscles, united by a thin aponeurosis, cover the whole upper cranium and are known as the Occipito-frontalis Muscle. At the back, this is attached to the occipital. At the back, this is attached to the occipital bone, while in front it interlaces with various face muscles. It is a powerful muscle and raises the brows, wrinkles the forehead, and draws the scalp forward. Long hair grows on the skin over it as a further protection against blows upon the skull and sudden variations in temperature. The temporal bones, said to be so named because the hair over them is the first to turn with age, are situated at the sides and base of the skull and are in three portions. The squamous are scale-like, the mastoid are nipple-like, and the petrous or stony portion. The squamous is the upper portion and has projecting from its lower part the long arched zygomatic process which articulates with the malar bone of the face and from which arises the masseter muscle, one of the chief muscles of mastication, which has its insertion in the ramos and angle of the lower jaw. Just above the zygomatic process, the temporal muscle has its origin in part, while below is the glenoid fossa for articulation with the condyle of the lower jaw, the posterior portion of the fossa being occupied by part of the parotid gland. Just above the zygomatic process, the temporal muscle has its origin in part, while below is the glenoid fossa for articulation with the condyle of the lower jaw, the posterior portion of the fossa being occupied by part of the parotid gland. The rough mastoid portion of the temporal bone is toward the back and affords attachment to various muscles, of which the most important are the Occipito-frontalis and the sternocleidomastoid. Within it are the mastoid cells, which communicate with the inner ear and are lined with mucous membrane continuous with that of the tympanum. They probably have something to do with the hearing. In children, they often become the seat of inflammation, mastoid abscess. In infectious diseases, and the mastoid bone has to be cut to let out pus that has collected. As the lateral sinus is directly behind the mastoid bone, there is very great danger of going through into the sinus and causing a fatal hemorrhage. The petrous portion, which contains the organ of hearing, is between and somewhat behind the other two portions, at the lower edge of the temporal bone, wedged between the sphenoid and the occipital bones, at the lower edge of the temporal bone, wedged between the sphenoid and the occipital bones, on its outer surface is the external auditory meatus, and from below projects a long, sharp spine called the styloid process, to which several minor muscles are attached. In the same angle between the petrous and the squamous portions lies the bony Eustachian tube, or Eustachian tube. The sphenoid or wedge bone, so called because in the process of development it serves as a wedge, lies at the base of the cranium, forming as it were the anterior part of the floor at the cavity containing the brain. It is a large bat-shaped bone and articulates with all the cranial and many of the facial bones, binding them all together. It has a body, two large wings and two lesser wings, and appears on the outside of the skull between the frontal and the temporal bones behind the zygomatic process. In the adult, the body of the sphenoid is hollowed out into the sphenoid sinuses, in which pus sometimes forms. The ethmoid bone. In front of and below the sphenoid and extending forward to the frontal bone is the ethmoid, the last of the cranial bones. It consists of a horizontal cribriform or sieve-like plate, from either side of which depend lateral masses of ethmoid cells. To the inner side of these masses are attached the thin curved turbinated bones, superior and middle, while between them is a vertical plate that forms the bony septum of the nose. Rising from the upper surface of the cribriform plate is another vertical plate, the crista galli, with the olfactory grooves on either side for the reception of the olfactory bulbs, filaments of the olfactory nerve passing down through the perforations of the cribriform plate to the nose. For the brain, which fills almost the entire cavity of the cranium, is supported by the sphenoid and ethmoid bones internally, as it is protected externally by the other cranial bones. Ossification of sutures. If premature ossification of all the sutures occurs, idiocy results. While in cephalocele, there is a groove in the ossifying of the bones so that the membranes or brain protrude. In rickets, the forehead is high and square and the face bones poorly developed, so that the head looks larger than it really is. And Paget's disease, or Paget, the bones enlarge and soften. This affects the head but not the face, and often the first thing noticed is that the hat is too small. Craniotabes is thinning of the bone in places, the bone becoming like parchment and being easily bent. It is generally caused by pressure of the pillow or the nurse's arm. In Paget's disease, PAGET, the bones enlarge and soften. This affects the head, but not the face, and often the first thing noticed is that the hat is too small. Craniotabes, CRANIOTABES, is thinning of the bone in places, the bone becoming like parchment and being easily bent. It is generally caused by pressure of the pillow or the nurse's arm. Bones of the face. The facial bones serve to form the various features of the face, which, after all, are merely organs of special sense. Many delicate muscles control the facial expression, which, consciously or unconsciously, reflects the character of their owner. Surgically, the most important of the facial bones are the two superior maxillary bones because of the number of diseases to which they are liable. They meet in front, together forming the upper jaw, and with the malar bone help form the lower part of the orbit of the eye. They are cuboid in shape and are hollowed out into the pyramidal cavity known as the Antrum of Highmore, which opens by a small orifice into the middle nasal meatus and which sometimes becomes infected and has to be tapped. The nasal process for articulation with the frontal and nasal bones has at its lower edge a crest for the inferior turbinated bone, and close behind this, on the inside, extending down from the upper edge, is a deep groove which, with the lacrimal and inferior turbinated bones, helps to form the lacrimal canal for the nasal tear duct. The bones give attachment to many small muscles, connected for the most part with the nose and mouth, of which the masseter is the only important one. The two malar or cheekbones are small quadrangle bones which form the prominences. The two malar or cheekbones are small quadrangular bones which form the prominences of the cheeks and help form the orbits of the eyes. Projecting backward from each is a zygomatic process for articulation with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, while a maxillary process extends downward for articulation with the superior maxillary. Here again, the most important muscle attached is the masseter. If the malar bone is crushed, great deformity results. The lacrimal bones are two small bones about the size and shape of a fingernail, situated at the front of the inner wall of the orbit. At the external edge is a groove which lodges the lacrimal sac above and forms part of the lacrimal canal below. The two palate bones are at the back of the nasal foci and help to form the floor of the nose, the roof of the mouth, and the orbit. Each has a vertical and a horizontal plate, and it is these last that by their juncture form the hard palate. Oftentimes, in cases of hair lip cleft palate, also occurs the result of incomplete development. To remedy the consequent opening in the roof of the mouth, which makes articulation difficult, operation is generally resorted to, though sometimes a plate is fitted over the opening by a dentist. The nasal bones are two small oblong bones which articulate with the frontal and superior maxillary bones and with each other. They form the bridge of the nose, the rest of the nose being wholly of cartilage, except for the vomer, a bone shaped like a plowshare, which forms part of the nasal septum, articulating along its anterior edge with the ethmoid and the triangular cartilage. The two inferior turbinated bones lie along the outer walls of the nasal fossae. They are thin, scroll-like bones covered with mucous membrane and serve to heat the air as it passes in. Sometimes when one has a cold, the membrane and the bone too swell up and close the nares. Loss of the sense of smell in a bad cold may be due to such swelling and the consequent impending of the entrance of odoriferous particles, a condition that would likewise interfere with the sense of taste. Part of the bone is sometimes removed to enlarge the passage, enough being left to warm the air. Lastly, there is the inferior maxillary bone or lower jaw. This has a horseshoe-shaped body and two rami, one at each end. Each ramus has a pointed process in front called the coronoid process, into which is inserted the temporal muscle at the back and separated from the coronoid process by the sigmoid notch is the condyle, which articulates with the glenoid fossa on the temporal bone. The rami also gives attachment to the masseter muscle at its point of insertion. In adult age, the ramus is almost vertical, but in old age, the portion of the jaw hollowed out into alveoli and the teeth becomes absorbed and the angle of the jaw very obtuse. On the inner side of the jaw, near the middle, on either side, is the fossa for the sublingual gland, while the supramaxillary gland lies in a fossa farther back on either side. Sometimes the lower jaw is dislocated, and when once this has occurred, it is liable to occur again, the ligaments becoming stretched. End of chapter 3.